Welcome to Equine-Assisted World. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times bestselling author of The Horse Boy, founder of New Trails Learning Systems and LongRideHome.com. You can find details of all our programs and shows on rupertisaacson.com. Here on Equine-Assisted World, we look at the cutting edge and the best practices currently being developed and established in the equine-assisted field. This can be psychological, this can be neuro-psych, this can be physical, this can be all of the conditions that human beings have that these lovely equines, these beautiful horses that we work with, help us with. Thank you for being part of the adventure, and we hope you enjoy today's show. Welcome back to Equine-Assisted World. Today I've got Kim Barthel. I'm pronouncing that correct? Not Barthel, but Barthel.
You got it. It's Barthel.
From Canada. And the reason we've got Kim on today is because our great friend, who's also going to come on here, Liana Tank, who's one of the most interesting human beings on the planet, basically. And I'm going to get her on here for her own interview soon to do with her work with the most intense populations of the criminally insane, and how she is working neurobiology, neuroscience and horses and all of that into that. She said, Rupert, there's this lady, Kim Barthel, and you've got to bleeping, bleep, 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 have her on the show. And I looked at Kim Barthel and I went, bleep. She kind of doing what we do, but she was kind of doing it before we were doing it. And I'm talking about the movement method end of what we do, because remember that I'm always encouraging all of us horse-obsessed nutters to get away from the horse sometimes, because remember that not every person who comes or kid that comes is going to be motivated by the horse. Sometimes they are motivated on Monday, but not on Thursday. And even if they are motivated, what are you doing with the rest of the time that they're with you? Because 90% of the time they're not on the horse. And then also, what are you going to do when you send that client home, either to their family if it's a kid, or home themselves if they're an adult? What insights, what tools, what games, what brain building stuff are you going to give them so that they can keep it going as a 24/7 culture of movement and neuroplasticity at home? Because if not, then yeah, sure. Anytime they come to one of our centers, it's better than a kick in the face. But we all know it won't get the job done. The only thing that gets the job done is when there's a full participation. So that's why we need people like Kim Barthel to come along and mentor us. So Kim, can you tell us who you are, where you are, what you do, and why?
This is a podcast, so you can't see me smiling, but it's big from one ear to the other. And thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you.
Well,
I have known about you a very long time.
Well, that sounds ominous.
In a very positive way. Of course, because of the famous Horse Boy movie and my work in the field of special needs, neurodiversity, autism. This is year number 40. That makes me feel a bit nauseous, but that's the way.
A day over 12, so you can...
Bless you. So I'm an occupational therapist historically, with many things that came after. A specialty in neuroscience, neurobiology, sensory processing, and movement. And ended up working in the field of trauma for most of my career, sort of with deep love, passion, and unexpectedly. So
more trauma was a thing, right?
Yeah, before trauma was a thing, before it was a thing. And so putting those pieces together is what I'm interested in. The mind, body, spirit way of thinking of human experience. The name of our company is called Relationship Matters. And so the tagline, the mission of our company is to support the conscious evolution of the human spirit, and how that fits into the realm of how people can become their best self.
Now, you, in our little preamble, said you are, see if I get this right, a neuro-developmental treatment instructor.
You got it. Good question. Well, in our rehab fields of physical therapy, occupational therapy, There are lots of theories, frames of reference for how to support people in becoming better at moving their bodies. And neurodevelopmental treatment was developed in the 50s by a lady named Mrs. Berta Bobath, right after World War II, after World War II. Because rehab in that era was not really very clued in yet to the brain.
Right.
And how to change motor system, stroke, cerebral palsy, kids with spina bifida. This was very new. Polio in that era. And Mrs. Bobath, she learned through her own intuition. As you know, most magical, amazing things are often, I think, intuitively channeled. This came from her, and she was a sculptor. And through putting her hands on people's bodies, she helped them learn to bring online the muscles that were inaccessible, and to quieten the ones that were working too hard. And this technique she called handling, putting your hands on the body to help. And you really deeply have to understand anatomy and how muscles work together. And so this theory became the way that the popular mechanism of how therapists would treat, especially children, with neuromotor challenges in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, until today.
Okay, what got you attracted to this?
Kind of serendipitously, really, because when I first graduated from university, my love was the sensory systems. And I went to study with Dr. Jean Ayres.
Why? Why was it the sensory systems your first love?
I don't know. You know how sometimes you just know you know something? And it's like, I've been doing this.
Did you have sensory issues yourself?
Not really. Not in the way that you think about it.
Were you surrounded by people that did?
I really, yes, I was exposed to children with neurodiversity as a child. And I wanted to.
And how come? How come? Because a lot of people were not back then. That there was a lot of separation.
I don't know that I can answer that question to you. I think
They
it's
were in your
just
school, they were in your family, they were in your
no,
groups.
just sort of an exposure.
Mhm.
And I guess a personality quality of mine is I have a deep desire to do something meaningful and also different. So occupational therapy is and was in the 80s something that people didn't have a clue what it was. And when I started in my path of university, this theory of sensory integration for kids with autism was so fascinating to me because it was so mysterious. And it made sense that if I was struggling with processing, it would impact the way I engage in the world. And that's why I started there. Yeah.
What I find intriguing is that in the 80s, obviously through the 90s and early 2000s, the main way of looking at autism treatments was through behavioral, ABA and so on. And we're still battling with that to some degree in the USA, even though in other parts of the world, it's, thank God, been consigned to history. How come you weren't drawn to that? Because that was the prevalent thing. And why to the sensory integration? And did you face opposition?
Big time. I think that the behavioral approach never resonated with me. And I guess that.
Why was that?
Well, I guess that spiritual component that I'm talking about over and over again here was just in my fabric. And I don't mean religious. I mean the compassionate state of human behavior.
Mm.
It just was who I was. And none of that ever felt right. And Dr. Ayers was all about the child guides treatment,
Interesting. Really
child-centered
interesting.
practice
And this is back in the
in the 80s. Yeah.
because our ethos with the movement method is follow the child, right? And
Yeah.
I was given that by Dr. Temple Grandin, who was of course given that by her mother. So you could argue that movement method is really a result of mentorship from Temple Grandin's mother. But even when I was trying to follow that advice in the early days, in the early 2000s, my God, was the opposition vicious. You must have faced a fair amount of attacks and spears.
I'm smiling because Temple Grandin is a commonality between us.
Okay.
At my very first conference, I was 20 at the Ayers Clinic. I was introduced to Temple Grandin. So in a sense, Dr. Ayers gave her to me as my practicum.
Interesting.
And Temple was developing her hug machine at the time. And she gave me the inside experience of what it was like to live in a body that processed differently. And she could put words to it. And so I have known her for 40 years. And she was a profound influence on this idea of being with people where they are.
What was, if you could say in one line, what she told you that resonated in words, what did she say?
Well, it's really actually not what she said specifically as in one thing. It's how she would give me feedback. So for example, she may not remember this, and she might hope she giggles if she does. She said to me, Kim, I had a sweater on. Why are you wearing a carpet? And I of course, had no knowledge about
Well, that's not
anything.
fair, because she wears sweaters. She knows what a sweater is.
But it was the nature of the quality of
I
the
see.
fuzz, right? And she said, and then she went on to describe how that hurt to look at it.
Interesting.
Yeah. And
It was
just
the texture
the texture
of that sweater.
sweater.
Looked like a
Yeah. Like,
note to self: in September, when I'm going to be hanging out with her, no sweater.
right.
Yeah.
And then she said something to me like, stop moving your lips. I'm trying to listen to you. And I was like, I don't know if I can do that. Because she was working hard on processing my speech and my face at the same time.
Okay.
Right.
That's
And
very...
those are the things that had deep, profound impact for endlessly for the future.
Yeah, I could see that. One of the things we never do is demand any kind of eye contact, right, from a kid. We say, if they look at you, great. If they don't, be interesting, they might. But if they're not looking at you, they're probably taking in what you're saying, in the same way that if someone's listening to this podcast while driving a car, they don't need to look at us
For sure.
to take in what you're saying, right? Do you think if you had, at that point, turned your face away and said, okay, fine, Temple, look at the wall or turn away from me, just listen, like on the radio, might that have worked?
I mean, that's in fact what I did.
Okay.
And so I think this idea, we talked today about the neurodiverse affirming movement. I think I've been living that for my whole career, of not trying to get people to be what I want them to be, but to how I can be with them. And that's what I think she taught me in that conversation.
Brilliant. I would love to get together over a bottle of wine with you two. I will probably be the only one drinking wine, but it'll certainly help lubricate my understanding.
But you asked me also, how did I get to movement?
Yes. Well,
so Dr. Ayers looked at me one day, who to me was like, I couldn't think of anyone that was more important as a mentor.
Mhm.
She said, Kim, you've got to go learn about the body. And I was like, okay. I'm like 21 years old and I don't know anything from anything. And I said, okay, I'll go do that. What does that mean? And she said, well, I think that neurodevelopmental treatment, go and study with Mrs. Bobath in London, the UK. You got to go do that. And I was like, okay. So I tripped off to take what we call an 8-week certification course with Mrs. Bobath. And
That's such a great name, Bo.
it is, isn't it? And that was the beginning of that part of the collective thought process. And I think that, one of the reasons that she asked me, Dr. Ayres, reflectively, Dr. Ayres passed away, so I never had a chance to ask her why. Why me and why that? But with reflection, I think it was about how sensation impacts and connects to the body in movement, which was not part yet of the fully developed, fully baked theory of SI at that time.
SI being?
Sensory
integration. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And were you yourself someone who moved a lot? Are you still now someone who moves a lot?
That's such a good question. Honestly, no.
Okay. Interesting.
And I think that also, I mean, I was a dancer.
Well, then, yes.
And I never felt good enough.
You like a classical dancer, like ballet?
Classical dancer, yeah.
Oh, that's the problem, perfectionism. It's just like dressage. It's Iyengar yoga. When we go for perfectionism, we just kill the joy. Yeah.
Yep. And so my love of movement was, dampened by the experience of not ever feeling good enough. And I was shocked when Mrs. Bobath said, I think you need to teach this, because never did I think that I would be skilled enough to do that. So
you'd given up on dance early, like in childhood or in your
17. I don't think of that as so early. I did it, classical dance for 17 years.
And was it a great love, classical dance, or actually was it just something that you were made to do and you actually like to move in every way?
No one ever asked me these questions before. Good for you. It's a combination. It was intermittent, There was times of great love, and then times of, I can't stop this because I'm in the flow of it, feeling like there's some need to complete something.
I am in blood steeped so far that to turn back were as tedious as to go up. That's my bath. He said when he feels he can't stop because the momentum is taking him. No, I know exactly what that feels. And one was often made to feel that way, of course, by family,
yes,
mentors, Did it break your heart?
Did it break my heart? I think I'm still working on it.
Yeah.
And I think that the lingering feeling of not good enough has been both a gift and a curse.
Right. And because, of course, the cold hard fact is that even the ballet dancers that make it, never feel good enough.
Yes.
And the axe to the chest that you've just described, of course, allowed you to view the world compassionately. But it's a rough go. It would be nice if kids didn't have to go through that in order to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, the gift of knowing movement from the inside, and then also witnessing or experiencing people who struggle to move. It just gave me a sense of embodied understanding, meaning I can feel movement as I watch movement.
That's interesting.
And without that experience, I don't think I would have that in me.
It's a really interesting thing. If movement's ever been taken away, and I know a lot of people listening to this will have been in situations where movement has been taken away, either permanently or temporarily. But for example, I smashed up both legs once, and I was parked on the couch for a long time. And the appreciation of being able to get up and go to have a pee, And
Right.
what a privilege that is, and what a privilege, in fact, that is. And
Yes. Yeah.
it's the stuff that I taken for granted, gratitude, versus entitlement. It really starts with movement. I mean, if you think about a slime mold,
Hmm.
put that slime mold into a labyrinth, and they see it go. Or they put the slime mold into a controlled thing where they put some toxin and it goes away from the toxin. If the slime mold couldn't find its way through the labyrinth, if the slime mold couldn't move away from the toxin, imagine even at that level cellular suffering.
Totally.
And I think that's something we can all relate to. So listen, you said that I actually thought that you were not a horse person. I was thinking, okay, I'm just going to be putting this one up there for the horse crazies amongst us, which include me, to remind us that we should, learn our neuroscience and all of this. But it turns out you actually do have a background with equine therapy. Can you just
Hmm.
go into that a little bit before we go on to the work that you actually do now and what we can learn from you, just so we can understand your context?
Sure. My connection to the horse world didn't come because of a love of horses. It actually came from a love of movement and seeing the horse as an offering for enhancement of movement experience for kids that, especially children, who had quite limited mobility, cerebral palsy, and the whole opportunity for weight shift, movement through space, experiencing connection with a being that allowed them to feel felt. This was my draw.
To be moved by something, lending you its power. Right?
Yes. And very quickly it was obvious to me that this was a relational experience.
When did you get involved in with therapeutic riding, and how?
So I lived in a place called Winnipeg, in Canada, and we had a startup therapeutic riding process
Mhm.
that was one woman who wanted to use her horses for the purpose of supporting kids with disability.
And this was when?
It would have been in the early 90s.
Okay.
Yeah.
And up until then, there was nothing there.
There was nothing, especially where I was living. I
Okay.
mean, I know that it existed before that, but not in the area where I was living. And given my appreciation and understanding of movement and sensation in this way, this organization sought me out and said, "Can you come and help us understand what we might do on the horse?"
Let's see. So they contacted you as a consultant.
Yes,
And what
correct.
did you show them? What did you suggest?
Well, I'll never forget the first time I went and we did back riding, meaning
Oh,
I was actually sitting on the horse with the child.
okay. Even though you're not a
And
rider.
yes.
So
And what
they'd obviously produce a nice, safe horse underneath you, right?
definitely, definitely. And this experience for me was necessary
Mm.
because not only was I feeling the movement of the child in front of me, but I was simultaneously experiencing the movement of the horse.
Fantastic.
And so there was this, I think I know you know exactly what I'm talking about. Sitting there with your child and feeling them while feeling the movement through yourself. And this was what helped me figure out, so to speak, that word is too literal, how we might use saddles in different ways, what could be done on a horse in a back riding situation, which I don't think is as common today.
No, I'd say Horseboy, us, we're one of the only people that do it. No.
Yeah. I don't know if it's good for the horse. I don't know.
It is if you make the back very strong, because the entire culture of Asia,
Mm.
Northern Asia, and most of the Americas would be all killing their horses if it wasn't, because that's how all their kids grow up, because they actually use horses for transport. So it's a interesting, rather racist viewpoint. that a lot of Western horse people have is that this must be bad for the horse. But where it writes off all those cultures immediately. However, where they're trying to be good is where it's coming from a good place, is they're concerned for the health of the horse's back. And it is true that if you're going to ride with someone in front of you, you want to make sure that you put inordinate amounts of muscle on the horse's back. So that's what we do. Yeah.
Very good. And so we also looked at changes in direction, reach into space, games, as you talked about earlier. What kind of stop-start, reach and throw. These were very early activities that we thought of to engage kids in moving their bodies in ways that they couldn't do sitting in a wheelchair or on the floor.
Tell us, those of us who don't know neuroscience,
Mm.
what do those activities do for the brain?
Ooh. Okay. Deep breath. Where do we start? What's so interesting about that question is what I know today versus what I knew then. Because our understanding of neuroscience today is so vastly different compared to the day of the 90s, where we're beginning to understand the concepts of neuroplasticity.
Yeah. It was a new word then.
It was a big new word.
Yeah.
And really the foundation of change, right? The potential for the brain to heal itself. Because prior to that time, it was believed that was not possible.
Right. I mean, it's not that long ago that even in mainstream neuroscience, the doctrine was the brain is hardwired at 5. We now know that's so not true, but it was orthodox for a while. Yeah.
Yes. And so the idea of neurodevelopmental treatment was even founded on this premise that there is learning happening all the time. And I don't just mean learning as in practical skills, but learning at a cellular level.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's funny you use the word a slime mold. I often give the description of I was working in the neuroscience lab, looking at a paramecium in a petri dish.
What's a paramecium for those of us that didn't know?
It's a single cell, and it has a brain in its membrane, and it knows where to swim and where not to swim, dependent on what's in the environment. And when you drop in a toxin into the petri dish, that cell will not move in that direction again. And this is the premise of rehab or never mind rehab. That sounds like, because for many kids, it's not rehabilitation, it's habilitation. Their bodies never had those experiences. So we understand that the brain is today we understand that the brain is multifaceted, interconnected circuits. That's non-hierarchical. That things are moving in loops. And impact in one area of the brain will have interface in other areas of the brain. And so when you are, for example, moving through space, side to side, forward and backward, we call this weight shift. On the horse, this impacts the brainstem, the cerebellum, the basal ganglia. These are blah, blah, blah words in the neuroscience way. It impacts the frontal cortex. It has an impact on structures of knowing where my body is and who I am and who I'm not.
Proprioception.
Yep. In interoception. This is me, this is not me. That all of these experiences that the horse offers integrates the brain in a way that allows circuits to wire together that they may not have an opportunity to do in a different environment.
And again, for those people for whom neuroscience is something new, why is that a good thing?
Why is it a good thing? First of all, one of the greatest challenges that is so poorly understood is that my sense of self, me or me in relationship to other, means that the sensory experiences that I'm taking in have to be felt by me as me. Gosh, that's abstract, isn't it?
Yeah, but it makes sense.
You know, I have to know that I'm moving, that there's an I. And I think that so many people with differently wired brains struggle with this,
Yeah,
struggle with knowing what's me and what's not me,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah, yeah. Where are the boundaries between myself and the world? You know, it's interesting. Rowan Scub, he's actually downstairs while I'm giving this. He's eating his dinner. He's just been helping today build a new fence pasture. And the 23-year-old hulking 6'1" dude who drives independently, who has his own car, who just sold, he's in the process of selling his house so that he can have money in investment that he can then live on. You know, this is a very, but he, as you know, he didn't start there. And he himself says the early years were a blur of feeling a confusion of not knowing where he began and ended. And that while that might feel good in a certain moment, in a sort of certain altered state of consciousness, if you go through life that way, it's really confusing and disorienting and alarming and upsetting. And that at a certain point, with all this movement and with all this integration with nature and all this sensory integration, effectively, things began to clarify. He talks about this with parents a lot. We were trying to understand what their kids are going through. It's very interesting that you were observing this, you know, back in the early 90s.
Well, this is why your work was so appealing to me. That when I first watched and read about Horseboy, I thought, of course, this and the idea of also the spiritual aspect, looking at person from a holistic perspective. It had a deep resonance of this is what's happening to the brain is you're putting together pieces that didn't necessarily connect well in isolated ways, that through opportunity, you've allowed those freeways that have an inherent design to connect, but just couldn't get there, now have the experience to do it.
Right. I think that's a really good point, that they have an inherent design, which of course is therefore desire, right? So why would it feel distressing to feel those blurred boundaries? Because as you say, we're designed to feel not hard boundaries, but nonetheless, we have an epidermis, you know, it stands between us and the world. We have, you know, and we have this sense of self, and this is our compass, this is our navigation. And so it's very interesting that you said design, because yes, to experience oneself not operating to one's innate design, how could that not feel alarming?
Definitely. And, you know, when we think about we are really designed for survival, not for comfort, darn it. And so we are
That's why
inherent.
God invented Scotch whiskey. Yeah.
Yes. And many other forms of adaptive behavior to help us with this experience called human life. But I think that we are tracking for danger constantly.
Yes. Yes.
And we regulate our sense of distress in the body. I have to feel me in order to regulate me.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds, I know that when I say that, that sounds fluffy, but it's like I have to understand what I'm experiencing at a very primitive level anyway, in order to feel safe in it.
Yeah, if I'm walking, it's interesting. We're having this talk, the screen saver thing is a photograph that we took last year in Etosha Game Reserve in Namibia, with my family. As you know, I spent time with the Bushmen, and we were on our way to meet them, the sun. And the picture that I'm looking at is of two young lions playing, and there's a herd of zebra behind them, and they're all grazing peacefully, but there's two zebra who are watching the lion. And behind them, there's a herd of springbok who are not bothering to watch the lions because they know the zebra are watching the lions. And the zebra know very well that as long as the lions are in that behavior, they're okay, but it needs to be monitored. And they also know that if those 3/4 grown lion cubs that they're playing, well, big cats live with their parents for up to 2 years. So it means that the females must be, the fully grown females, the lionesses, must be somewhere around. And either they're going to sneak around the back or they're hanging out close to their 3/4 grown cubs because they don't want the hyenas to come in again. So either way, the situation needs to be monitored, but they're not monitoring it in a way that is huge alarm. They're just keeping an eye while the rest of the herd grazes. If they didn't have a sense of self, I'm a zebra.
Right.
And that's a lion. And it's over there at that distance.
Right.
And this behavior means this in relation to am I safe, am I not safe? One could imagine that it would certainly add to the already probably quite great stresses of hanging out close to lions if you're a zebra.
You've described this in such an elegant way. And you're reminding me of my neurobiology professor, Robert Sapolsky, who wrote Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
Interesting.
And he is a neurobiologist, and studied exactly what you're talking about and how our autonomic nervous system, I call it the automatic nervous system, it has a knowing. And the knowing doesn't necessarily require language. It's a knowing that is very sensory-based, intuitive-based, that comes from this monitoring that you're talking about and allows me to shift into fight, flight, freeze, or a sense of centeredness that allows me to continue to monitor but not experience terror or fear. And if I didn't have an integrated sense of body, I wouldn't be able to do this.
This is really good. This is, I think for a lot of people, a word like, or phrase like sensory integration, it's one of those things you hear, and the first time you hear it, you're like, oh, what's that then? And then you go, oh, well, I'm supposed to sort of know what that is because so it's like people, when they hear autism, they're like, oh, what's that? And then, oh, I suppose I should. But no one actually says, well, it's these 3 letters, AUT, that should have an O on the end, auto, meaning the self, the Greek word for the self, locked in the self. So, and then you go, oh, right. Okay, now I understand what autism. Sensory integration is really interesting the way you explain it there, because I remember in my early days with all this, people saying, oh, sensory integration. I'd be like, oh, shit, I'm supposed to know what that means. Got no idea at all what that means. But unfortunately, I think a lot of times these phrases are thought up by academics. So, for example, like you said, autonomic, you rather call it automatic. I agree with you there, because when you hear autonomic, you just think, unfamiliar word. Don't hear that getting onto the subway every day. Don't hear that when I'm buying, my newspaper or whatever. It seems to exist only in this context. And it makes me feel kind of a bit stupid if I don't automatically know what it is. Sensory integration, I think a lot of these terms, the language, the jargon gets in the way of the understanding of the people.
Couldn't agree with more. And it's to make it into understandable concepts that is useful to families and to people who themselves are looking to be their best self.
So sensory integration then is, if I know who I am and where I am and what I am, then I know how to keep myself safe, basically.
You did it. I don't know if anyone else has said it that simply. Great bottom line. There's another thought I'm having as you're talking, that autism is not one thing.
Right.
That every person, most of the children that I've treated with autism are now in their 30s. They all have a different story, how they experience sensations. And it's often very simply described academically as being overly sensitive or having difficulty in processing a piece of information. This is not my experience. My experience is that there is a difficulty in putting pieces together, that often the way one sense works together with another sense isn't easy to make the puzzle whole. And so people really oversimplify their attempt to understand what it is I think the person who's differently wired is really living in.
It's an interesting thing. I think anyone who's ever taken a strong psychotropic and psychedelic drug has had that feeling of disintegration.
Correct.
And I think if one hasn't had that feeling of, oh shit, I'm sort of disappearing, I'm fragmenting, my cells are breaking up, I've not just lost control, but I am no longer me.
Right. Disembodied.
No, there is a me that's experiencing this, which is what anchors one in those experiences. Imagine going through that all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And trying to organize relationships.
Yeah.
And also mask so that you give people what they want. My heart breaks when I think about it.
I'll tell you a funny story, but it's a public story now. It's not me, but something that describes that perfectly is, have you seen the Carlos Santana documentary?
No.
Okay, it's brilliant. Okay, it's brilliant. I saw it on the plane. And when he played at Woodstock, they're going through this, and he was really young, and he'd be in the house band at the Fillmore in San Francisco, only because he tried to break in to see the bands, because he was this Hispanic boy from Tijuana, right? And that raised by mariachi, good musician. And when they said, "Hey, you're breaking in," they said, "Yeah, but I just really want to see the." And they said, "Okay, can you play guitar?" And they sort of challenged him, and he did that.
Wow.
You're awesome, and he became house band, sort of age 20, and then he finds himself at Woodstock, and apparently he says all those crazy facial contortions I'm doing at Woodstock. He said what happened was, I arrived on the helicopter, and I got off the helicopter, and there was Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead sitting. He said, "Here, take these." What are these? And they said, "These are this is very, very strong LSD. However, you're on the bill to go up in about 6 hours. This is a long concert, so you've got time to go up and go down." And so he went, "Okay, I did the math. I think I could do that." And it would apparently half an hour. "Okay, you're up." And he said he went on stage, and his guitar neck became a snake that he couldn't control, wobbly snake that was right. And he said all of those facial expressions I'm doing are me saying, because I've got a rooted sense of self saying, I know I am actually Carlos Santana. I know I am the of 100,000 people. And if this goes to hell, that's the end of me. In this extreme distress, saying to the guitar neck, no, he says, I'm saying, no, you will be a guitar neck. You will not floppy thing and try and get away from me. And he's, of course, playing the most extraordinary music as he's doing it. But he said it was very, very, very stressful. And I remember watching that on the plane and going, wow, that's such a good analogy for what I think a lot of people with neurodivergence go through, particularly in the early years.
Amazing. I know you know a lot about compassion. And I think that what's important in this conversation to me is that. And that's where it comes back to that question you asked me about the behavioral approach, which is such a different way of engaging with humans. Right? And how important it is to try to put our mind in the mind of the other.
Yeah. Well, of course, if one's trying to train robots, then of course, either to go into battle or stand in a factory line, that becomes of lesser importance, right? And that, is the inheritance, I think, of behaviorism. Because I certainly went through a school system that was a bit like that. They made us behave in certain ways that were designed to inure us to combat, basically, to be officers of the British Empire, be first over the top into the machine gun fire. And I think it works for that.
Compliance is necessary under extreme danger.
Under extreme danger. But
not when you spill your milk.
No. And I remember thinking, why do I want a compliant kid? Because if I get a compliant kid, that's a kid that will get into a car with an adult just because the adult says, I'm an adult, you must comply, get in the car. I want a cooperative kid, but I also want a challenging kid. I want a kid that says, no, I don't know you. Who are you? I'm not getting in that car.
And compliance actually diminishes curiosity.
Indeed. So, okay. We've got a largely equestrian audience here. And as I often say, we equestrians are a bit autistic in terms of our obsession with ponies. And it can be a bit hard for us to think in other terms sometimes. Give us your best advice if we are trying to serve a child's or a person's nervous system and brain. What are the 3 or 4 main things that if we don't do, will not just not have us succeed, but will absolutely ensure failure? What are the things that we must be aware of and must do?
Number 1, in all contexts of learning, is safety. And this comes from attunement. My experience of horses is they are incredible at this. In the attunement to the person that they're with. But also for us as facilitators in this process, safety is part of our responsibility as well. And when I use the word safety, I'm not just talking about physical safety. I'm talking about the speed that we move into situations, the tone of voice that we use, the nonverbal communication that we use as the adults.
You're talking about emotional safety.
Yes. That is the backdrop for the nervous system to open the door to the greatest degree of plasticity is safety. The second variability is repetition.
You've using a little thumbs up came out of your brain. So I'm thumbs upping your brain for that one. I couldn't agree more. The emotional safety. So bossy people, because we're so bossy. We're not even knowing we're bossy.
And it's important. That's an important variable.
Yeah.
Repetition, number 2, is that the brain loves repetition.
Okay.
From the perspective of wiring. So when you are looking to establish a pattern of relative permanent change, it means I need to do it again and again. And the third one, you asked me for 3, is the brain is a predictive brain. So it is constantly, whether you're neurodiverse or not, the brain is constantly trying to fill in the story of what it expects.
Okay.
And so the more often there's clarity and predictability in how you present what you do, the greater the degree the brain can rest in, again, safety, but also in its potential to expand a new pattern. So emotional safety, repetition, and predictability.
Now, play devil's advocate there. Emotional safety, no devil's advocate. But for repetition and predictability,
yes,
of course, we want to begin to help people to acquire the skill of dealing with non-predictability, because that's going to happen. And stuff that comes novel, new, i.e. need to learn it quickly without repetition. Can you talk us through how paying attention to repetition and predictability helps us deal with non-repetition and non-predictability?
Love it. And that's not a devil's advocate question. It's a very good question. I need to have a foundation, a platform first. And all that we've just spoken about around the ambiguity of processing, the lack of security in my own reliable way of understanding the world, that once that predictability and repetition are foundationally there, I have a launch pad to then move from. So in my world, we call this the just right challenge, where me as the support person is, again, through attunement, offering both security and risk in ways that are scaffolded so that the person knows that they can do it without moving outside their window of tolerance into fear, both physically, emotionally, cognitively. And so it's not black and white, right? It's an in the moment thing of, I watch you, I see the tenuousness in you, and I may say, we can do this. It's okay. And the nervous system becomes available. Alternately, I might choose a task that is genuinely too hard and dysregulates or decomposes the person. That doesn't mean I've lost. It means I have an opportunity for repair, where the person then knows they can survive a challenge that all of this happens in the arena, I think.
When you say in the arena, you mean in the riding arena?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons why, with what we do with Horseboy, we actually try to get out of arenas.
Out of the arena.
Because we want to encounter the world.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, if the weather's terrible in the arena, but if we can, we want to encounter the world. As you say, I want to give a platform of trust it'll be all rightness if we go out there. And we will encounter some things we don't know.
Yes.
And but not too much.
Right.
So I need a certain amount of control over the environment, at least in the early stages.
Yes.
Later on. So basically, do you feel it's about building resilience?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that resilience comes from trust, right? It begins with trust of you, trust of the horse, trust of me. And then I can venture into the unknown.
It's so interesting that you bring this up. When I was spending a lot of time with Kalahari San Bushman, I didn't realize, but I was being given a mentorship in parenting. And the reason was that what I was observing, the first thing I observed was that they co-slept with their kids. And they didn't co-sleep with their kids from some philosophical point of view. They said, hyenas come at night.
Right.
And they will take your shoes off your feet and you won't even feel it. They will certainly take your baby or your infant or even your small child that is even 60 centimeters away from you, and you won't know. So the only way you can keep them safe, let alone warm, because it also gets very cold at night, is to put them between two adults.
Yeah. And
the hyenas less likely to mess with that situation. That's why we do it, Rupert. That's what they said. I was like, got it. And I was like, oh gosh, right. So if the baby's crying because you put it in a crib to cry it out, I was put that way. I'm sure you were put that way. It means that somewhere in our nervous system, in our ancient DNA, it's saying, I've been left here for the hyenas. Better scream. No one's coming. Oh, hyenas will get me. And therefore, a certain despair must kick in. I wonder how much of our, angst and neurosis comes from those sorts of
Totally.
experiences that we have when we're barely conscious, but we're experiencing it on on that DNA level. And then what I noticed, which I think was a co-slept, right? And I remember a couple of my friends saying, "But Rupert, aren't you worried that Rowan will end up really dependent if you do that?" And what I'd observed with these kids is that at about 16, they get up, they take a spear, and they go into the bush, and they come back with a wildebeest, and dodging the lions. It's like, no, it seems that if you give them all this unconditional love at the beginning, weirdly, they are more secure.
Exactly.
Not-
Completely agree. So,
What do you think is the most common error most of us that work in the field of neurodivergence routinely make? And what's the sort of easy fix that we often miss that we don't see?
you are asking me all the hardest questions. I think the greatest error we make is trying to come to some sense of what we think normal is.
Mhm.
The myth of normal. And that we are trying to be guided by goals that are constructed to help that person fit in. That's going to take us a long time to shift and change. But I think those of us who work with and support individuals who are different is to help them see their own value in who they are and allow them an increased opportunity to feel safe in themselves so that they can become their best self.
How do we do that?
Journey, it's like a journey, really.
Mm-hmm.
It's a ongoing standing alongside with curiosity about what's interesting to you and how do I join you. And you just described it in your Kalahari example. How do I join you, keep you safe, and build a bridge for you to explore at the same time? And we're talking about human attachment, which is a unfolding process. We could talk about this forever.
Oh, we could. I fully intend to.
I'm not inviting myself, but I am coming to teach in Ireland in October. So
Well,
maybe there's an opportunity to meet in person.
indeed, we will be there. And you need to meet, and everyone listening needs to meet a man called David Doyle. David will not come on this podcast, even though he is the man I probably work the closest with in my, professionally, because he hates to public speak, even though he's really good at it. And he is, in fact, I think, the modern day incarnation of the Wizard Merlin in a bad pullover. He'll kill me for saying that. But he's an extraordinary person. And yes, I would love to work with you in the many horse-boy movement method places that are growing in Ireland, because Ireland is where the Minister of Health, Anne Rabbitt, just got behind the latest horse-boy place, which is called Stuart's Care in Kilcloon, outside of, in County Meath, outside of Dublin. And it's a very ambitious, very large-scale project. And she has put the ministry behind it. So yes, I think there's a natural collaboration there, and I would invite anyone listening to try and get your asses over to Ireland and come hang with us over there with what's going on, because it is really good. You know what we don't have going on much, Kim, is stuff in Canada. But it sounds like you've got it covered, so we don't have to worry.
Hardly. And lots of opportunity for conversation.
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
Do you need to run?
I do.
Okay.
They're actually standing at the top of the stairs
Okay.
for me to
Waiting
stop.
for the construction guys. All right. Well, I think what we're going to do, Kim, because this is too good of an opportunity to miss, I'm going to have you come back on if that's all right. I want to go a little deeper into the neuroscience. Okay. So with your permission, we'll do a round two.
It's lovely.
Okay, listeners, we actually had to take a break in between the first part of this podcast and this one because Kim's a busy lady and she had to go on a massive world tour doing incredible work. And now she's back, and she's back from outer space, here to find her here without that look upon her face. Sorry, I couldn't resist that one. She's got some interesting stuff to report, and there's a lot that we need to know from her and the people she works with about trauma. But any of us that are in this line of work, this is a rapidly developing field, and particularly when we're dealing with people with neurodivergence, it gets complex. So welcome back, Kim. What have you been up to?
First of all, let me say it's exciting to be back and
Yeah.
have a conversation with you. One of the interesting things that happens to me in dialogue with you that is unique is that, you know, when you think about this concept of tuning forks and you hold one up and one is sitting beside, and if they're not quite at the right frequency, they don't resonate.
Mm.
And when I hear your questions, listen to what you're thinking about, my frequency just dials up at such a high vibration that it's exciting. And I find myself having to work to contain it so that I can even slow down long enough to think, just at the enthusiasm that I have for what comes out of these dialogues. It's quite an honor for me. So I wanted to start by saying that.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Okay, so what have you been up to?
So what have I been up to? Well, I say we because Bob Spenceley, who is my husband and business partner, we have been on the road since the middle of August and sharing. But you know, it's
Where have you been on the road? You haven't just gone like down the road to the shops.
no.
Like, where have you been?
Six continents, 17 countries.
Why? What were you up to?
I was thinking about saying sharing knowledge, but that is so inaccurate because it's a mutual experience. It's not just a sense of Kim and Bob going on the road, giving a workshop. It's a holistic gathering of experience that builds on itself. And what we find is the world has more in common than you can imagine.
Yeah.
You know, despite the context, the culture, the distance, the climate, all these variables that shape the differences from one place to another, there is more similarity than difference.
What's the main theme that's come out of these workshops? And for those of us who are working in this equine-assisted field, what do you feel are the resonances that are coming out now that we should all be aware of?
It seems that there is a need, a desperate need, for a feeling and of hope that can lead to agency.
Okay.
And this theme is pervasive no matter where.
People feeling powerless, people feeling lost.
People feeling powerless, people feeling victimized,
Okay.
people feeling hopeless in their capacity to have any ability to create a difference for themselves. And even though we have lived through a pandemic, and this may in fact be partly post-pandemic, it was more obvious than last year.
Okay. Is that because of just combined world events, Russia, Gaza, climate?
Definitely.
Stuff? Is it not really event specific, do you think? What
I think
going
my
on?
perception is that people hook it onto an event, but the event is a moving target of placement of underlying angst.
Okay. And you feel this angst is getting greater?
I do. And there's a sense of need for increased compassion
Mm-hmm.
and connection with each other as a way of, in a way that is honoring of each other's beliefs, values, systems of engagement. So there is a need for honoring connection, but and being heard and valued more than I've ever seen.
What are the tools? What's the main tools that you go in? And again, I'm imagining the listeners probably nodding as they're driving, listening to this, thinking, yeah, actually, gosh, this is a lot of the people walking through my door right now. This is a lot of my clients that even, because I think for a lot of us who started with working with, say, quite severely autistic people and so on, although we still do, now we kind of work with everybody. And it seems that everyone's amygdala is jangling. And now people are walking through our door who would not have walked through our door 5 years ago, I think, pre-pandemic. So when you begin your workshops, can you tell us what's in your toolbox? What are like the 5, 6 main things that you walk in there and say, listen, lads, this will help?
Well, the very first thing that happens in a workshop, in any workshop, in every workshop, is storytelling. I mean, one of the things I think that I am known for is plugging into story, which is so different than sharing of information. And through the emotional vibration of story, it immediately creates a sense of I'm not alone.
Common
And
humanity. Yeah.
yeah. And I think that, like, for example, one story I tell all the time is about a kid that sat in my office for 2 years in the Arctic of Canada, who was an elective mute. He had witnessed his grandmother be mauled by a polar bear.
Hmm.
And he had 9 different labels attached to him. And he was so angry and so dangerous. And he sat with me in silence for 2 years. And I felt like such a failure because I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't doing psychotherapy. It felt empty. And I worried about him all the time. When we left the Arctic, I was concerned that he, in fact, may end his life or be dangerous to others. And so 5 years after leaving this location, I got to see him again. And he walked up to me in the Inuit Center in southern Canada and said, "You, Blondie." I heard his voice for the first time. And he said to me, "Want you to know, you stopped me from killing myself every day for 2 years. And I carry you with me in my head and my heart every day." And the reason that story is so important is because it's not about doing. It's about being with people from a state of love, presence, connection. And all of us worry about what it is we're going to say.
Hmm.
And so that story, for example, leaves people feeling, I can do that too.
Hmm.
I can show up, be present, sit with people, listen, tap into love. And that has meaning.
This is really interesting. I have a couple of boys that come to me from a local international school more or less weekly, and they come with certain stories. And what I find their great need is for space and moving through nature.
Right.
And of course, I can provide that because I can take off into the forest with them with a couple of horses, so that when they get, initially they actually often want to walk, but then when they get tired, their legs get tired, they can ride. And I can provide things like the creek and groves of beech trees, or a particular oak, or a place we know where you're likely to see deer, or a little thing where a place you have to scramble over some rocks. And it changes with the season. Places we go to gather apples in the fall, or cherries in the early summer, or whatever. And what I find, you're dead right, is that the stories just come out. I don't need to ask much, except once they get rolling, of course, oxytocin rocking in the hips, they tend to talk. Once they're on that horse, it's a communication hormone. But then I can then respond. And then what often happens is there's just mutual storytelling. So the story can be, me talking about what's going on in the landscape. That's a story. Or why the landscape looks the way it does. And that's a story. Could be history, could be geology, could be, and then maybe an experience that I've had that matches an experience that they've had. And it becomes a conversation. I think you're right that this type of connection and this type of conversation, funnily enough, can't be taken for granted anymore, but it used to be. What do you think about that? Are we losing the skill to converse and connect?
There are such,
just to talk to me about that.
there are beautiful elements in what you said that are more than just the conversation. And it's the concept of holding space, which is bigger than dialogue, that comes with intention and a sense of willingness to be present to the other. And that is a skill set because it requires attunement. So as I listened to you tell the story of nature, which does so much of the work for us, and the presence of the horse, which does so much of the work, it makes room for safety, for relationship to perhaps be safe for the first time. For some of the people that join us in these spaces, safety cannot be taken for granted. So the elements of nature and the horse and you, what a combination of opportunity that is active in evoking a sense or a portal to the feeling of safety.
Is it the feeling of, so it's not so much perhaps then, or is it not so much perhaps then that we're losing the ability to converse, or we're losing the ability to connect, because we seem to connect, whenever we can. We're a connective species. But is it safety that we've lost? Is it, weirdly, although most of us live in very, very safe, physically very safe environments, why have we lost the sense of safety?
Well, when you ask that question to me, I'm not sure I ever had it.
Go on.
Really? I mean, I'm
right, but you're not, the bombs are not dropping,
No.
right where you are. You know what I mean? It's so
There's a difference between physical safety
Mhm.
and emotional safety. You can grow up in the most safe home community and feel completely dismissed, emotionally disconnected, not valued, not seen, not heard. You can grow up in affluence, where everything is abundant in your environment, and still not feel felt by another person. So safety is relative, and we have that dialogue all the time, that what is safe to one. I mean, there are so many communities where there is danger, and there is emotional, relational safety.
Absolutely. No, you're right. I mean, I observed that among the San and the Bushmen, where you go out into the bush and there's lots of dangerous animals out there. But of course, people are very competent in that environment, so they know how to minimize those dangers. But what they're not afraid of is their fellow human, or at least not their own fellow humans. Maybe some of the ones that come in from the outside. But given that we have, I mean, okay, there are wars going on and so on, but given that most of us have more physical safety, I think, than ever, is that almost like an inverse correlation between that and a sort of deadening of community? And does community almost need a certain amount of mutually experienced risk in order to connect?
I do believe that shared experience of danger creates an interesting sense of intimacy because of the collective collaboration required.
Right. Yes, we cannot fragment or the hyenas will eat us, sort of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I will never forget, I worked on the India-Pakistani border during post-earthquake. And these are people that generally, day to day, despise each other. And under the conditions of shared danger, they carried each other back and forth into safety. The shared experience at least temporarily brought them into a space of care for each other.
Right. And presumably we don't want to create, unnecessary dangers, but is it that we need to create joint senses of purpose?
Correct. I completely.
And is the hopelessness that you're talking about actually purposelessness?
Exactly. And I think that becomes revealed as the dialogue unfolds, that there is a sense of emptiness, purposelessness, and a sense of disconnection.
So, okay, you go into these workshops with story.
Yeah, that's how it starts.
That's you're opening that toolbox. What else is in that toolbox?
And then what happens is one story, I call it the sideways approach. I tell a story, and then the resonance of the tuning fork starts. And people's light bulbs go on. And we weave back and forth between information. This is what's happening in the nervous system when. And what the information does is decrease shame.
Okay.
That when people have a general understanding of their nervous system, they feel like, oh my gosh, it's not that I'm that I don't have enough courage. It's not that I'm flawed. It's not that I don't have enough skills. It's that my nervous system is doing the best that it can with what it has. And that knowledge, which creates a sense of self-compassion and allows people self-understanding. And I got a great example of that. I was supporting a veteran in the Ukraine, doing work by Zoom. And he had just been in combat and was describing his experience of combat and all of the bombs around him. And he said, that's not what I'm having flashbacks about. What I'm stuck on, he said, is the fact that I soiled myself during combat. And I feel so, he pooped his pants. He said, I feel like I'm so, he used not capable. And then when he understood, this is exactly what your nervous system does when you are in these states of self-protection.
Now that surprises me because I know a few people with that story. And in combat units, there's often just a sort of running dark humor that, the battlefield smells of shit. Because that's what's going on. Was there no camaraderie with his unit in that regard?
I would say definite camaraderie, but lack of knowledge.
Okay.
I mean, this is early on
Mm,
at the onset of the Ukraine conflict,
okay.
and many of them are not even soldiers,
Yeah, yeah,
everyday citizens solicited into combat
yeah.
without any prep, without any knowledge, and creating a so-called platoon out of without training at
Mm,
that time.
mm.
So I think that it speaks to the development of connection, perhaps through those experiences, and the chance to be together as a team.
Right.
Speaks to
So,
your
so
earlier
go
point,
ahead. Sorry.
It speaks to your earlier point of shared danger and being able to work that through together.
He must also have felt a great sense of pride at having stepped up to defend
Definitely.
his country from a terrible aggressor. So, would you say that his shame was still outweighed by his sense of worth for having fulfilled that role? Or did it actually impact his sense of worth for having fulfilled that role?
Love that question. And as I pause to contemplate that question, the speed with which the shame transformed speaks to the lack of its grip on the overall sense of self. It was more, there's shame in the core self, which is so deep. And this was more shame around action at one time
Mm,
that shifted in its grip of his nervous system and day-to-day coping
mm,
that didn't take long to transform.
okay.
So your question makes me think that it really, when we think about the complexity, this is what you're asking, is the complexity of trauma and all the variables in an individual psyche that make it complex trauma. This person, I would say, did not have a history of developmental trauma in his persona that made the traumatic experience be tagged as more event-based
Mm.
rather than holistically having a grip on his entire being. It was such a good question you asked.
It brings another question, which is that I think everyone who's listening to this works with trauma to some degree, and also probably their own at the same time. It's so interesting. Is shame a paper tiger? Is shame a chimera? Is shame just our psyches and the conditioned, colonized psyche, which for social control, religion, whatever, make us feel ashamed of masturbating or whatever, and so therefore we'll go be depressed and fight your wars for you, basically that sort of thing. Just be, repressed and unhappy, and therefore very happy and willing to pick up a gun. Is shame actually just an illusion, almost like a hologram to scare us? And is it even real? Is it even necessary?
Well, I think, the urge in my response to your question is to think from my neurobiology orientation.
Go on.
In that, we are, I believe, wired for connection. And any time there's a sniff of rejection, abandonment, separation, difference, the nervous system notices this and contributes to the box that we identify as the shame parts of ourselves, because Shame doesn't live there alone. You know, we are each made of many parts. You described in my vet the pride which stands beside the shame, right? So we are not one or another. But our nervous system, for example, our amygdala, 1/3 of it is designed to notice the nonverbal cues of rejection. And that gets tagged alongside a sensory experience. So if I'm, for example, poop my pants and the guy beside me looks at me with disgust, then I'm going to code those simultaneous cues, and they accumulate in my nervous system to contribute to those parts of myself that experience I'm not good enough, I'm flawed. And they can stack up, which is, I think, what people talk about when they describe things like microaggressions or experiences of racism and ableism, things that make us feel different than others, which the nervous system can perceive as significant enough to feel traumatic.
Right, because they carry the risk of ostracism, and our nervous system says, if you're ostracized, the hyenas get you.
You're not safe.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No.
And I think, so the illusion that you're talking about, I think we will give up ourselves to sustain connection at all cost, really, with our people.
Right, that's gang culture, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, okay, there's jumping ahead of myself. So I'm just, the question that formed in my mind, I'm going to leave for a moment. So you open your toolbox. We've gone story, connection. We've gone informing people about their nervous system, which can transform shame. Useful. What's next?
Well, in the moment, what usually happens in front of our eyes is activation.
Tell us, can you define, what does activation mean?
People in the audience typically have a response to the story or to the information that looks like many things. Sometimes it looks like anger.
Okay.
Sometimes it looks like changes in pallor in their face, color. You can also see dissociation, where people, their eyes become empty. And this is why it's so good to do this work as a team, because it's hard to see that in large numbers of people. You can also feel it, as I know you know what I mean. You feel it in you. Ooh, the energy in the room just changed. There was more silence. There was big space in time that seems to require more processing. So the actual process is in front of your nose of what it is can be helpful. And so stepping into that, for example, I have a person in the audience who puts up their hand and either engages in active defense, or someone, over to my right checks out. I may then move closer to them in physical proximity in a very careful, cautious, kind way. And then I'm narrating what I'm doing. I see. This is really hard, this conversation. I put sometimes my hand on my own chest. And validation is critical. When someone gets angry at something that you've said, which is just another indication of a stress response, it's a moment of, ooh, I hear you, I feel you, I see you. And this is what we needed, wanted as children in the attachment, where the resilience came from or could come from in the first place. So in a sense, what we are doing is repeating the formula over and over and over again of the very same thing we wanted as infants. And so even though you're talking about the brain, it's like a portal into the soul. And the person in front of you who says, you know, that's just bullshit, for excuse me, my language, but, and you say, oh, I feel ya. You know, that just hit something there. And there's no interpretation, no my desire to want to fix it, right? You just sit there in the presence of sadness, anger, fear, like a container for those feelings, which is what often didn't happen for many of us when we were little. People told us, don't cry. Don't be mad. Come on. Big boys don't cry.
Mm.
Or it's more subtle than that. We get moved on quickly. Or someone shores us up. Hey, but look at all the great things you can do. So that capacity to sit in connection to one's own feelings is where the resilience comes from. And that emerges from having somebody do it with you first.
At what point do you explain to the people in the workshop that this is how they're building resilience? Because when the amygdala is activated, as you know, anger, dissociation, fear, the intellect has gone on vacation. So one cannot in that moment appeal to an intellectual or logical process. So can you talk us through that then? When amygdala is activated, you're validating. And at the same time, you would like to be able to show them, but look, you're building resilience here by allowing yourself to have this emotion and then move through this emotion to the next emotion. Talk us through the skill sets that you help people to garner.
I think, I wish the audience could see that I'm smiling, because the answer is it depends.
Mm.
You know, it depends on a number of variables. The formula is always the same, really. What changes is the duration, the timing. This is attunement.
Okay.
Right?
You get better at it. It gets quicker.
Better at it. At attuning when to move in, when to back out, when to just nod, when to move my body away. Sometimes it's too intrusive to be up close. When to actually change the subject sometimes.
Mm.
When to front load with information, when to step into emotion. This is 40 years of practice, of skill, of doing lots of messing up and continuing to mess up and continuing to repair. And at the same time, I often, not always, but often am narrating what I'm doing while I'm doing it.
Okay.
So that the audience is like a witness and an experiencer at the same time.
So does that mean that when someone has had an amygdala reaction within the workshop or session, client session or whatever, is the validation followed by is it the validation that allows the amygdala to relax?
Yes.
And opens the way to the intellect? Because is it the validation that says to the amygdala, don't worry, you're actually not about to be rejected and left out for the hyenas, and you remain connected despite the fact that you're waving your arms around and shouting or whatever that would normally drive people away. I'm validating you here, so I'm staying with you. And then some seconds pass and the amygdala deactivates the cortisol.
Sometimes it's not seconds. Sometimes it's hours.
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
So you have that time in a workshop? You have that time in
Well,
a client session?
yeah, yes and no. So
Right.
here's how
I'm just thinking about, someone saying,
yeah,
well, here I am in the arena with my horse with this person and they've kicked off.
yeah,
I don't have, a week.
yeah. And you're going to also have another opportunity.
Okay.
Okay. But the validation needs a little bit of clarity here. You're meeting people where they are. You're showing up. It's like I'm enraged. And you stand there and meet me without joining me. The validation is not validation of the information. I'm not validating your story. I'm validating the truth of your experience, what it is that you are feeling. And that's the portal to safety right there.
Right.
But in that, I'm not all nicey all the time. A lot of, someone is swearing at me. I work with youth who, swear words are as common for them as and they're in your face, right? If I was all nicey and nurturing all the time, they would feel that that's not authentic, right? It's meeting you in the vibration, finding it in me.
So when you're not nicey, then can you give us an example of that? Like, okay, I'm effing and blinding at you now and wanting to get a rise out of you.
So
And
it's
you don't want to be too nicey, but at the same time, you don't want to be too not nicey. So yeah, talk us through that.
The not nicey doesn't come out necessarily in words. It comes out in your body. When you think about nurturance, for example, the nonverbals that we draw from in nurturance typically are how you use your voice, melodic, how you might use your eyes, how you lean your body in, what your gestural system does. It's a nonverbal approach system. Whereas when there is anger or threat, it requires boundary for the other and me. That's containment. So that often demands from me standing up tall, pulling all my energy up, using my voice in a different tone, and saying, this is not okay. I can be with you in your anger, but I do not need to accept your rudeness. That would be an example.
What's the reaction to that? Do they double down?
It's usually
Okay.
because I'm not going to go. And I wrote a book with a former National Hockey League champion who survived by rage. And that I use my greatest teacher, because I would say that my greatest fear was rage and the feeling of violence. And it takes practice to step in boundary and not own it. As an example, other people are completely activated by crying and tears, or they feel manipulated, right? Or out of control. We each have our own blind spots. And to meet the other person where they at means I have to do the work of being able to have a place for those emotions within myself.
One of the things which I try to cultivate, I don't always manage to, but I do try, is I call it the happiness garden, where when I'm in challenging situations or feeling disappointed, or it doesn't have to involve another person, but it can do. The last 5 years or so, I've tried to make a practice of feeling like there's a happiness garden in my chest.
Mm.
And that when I'm feeling rocky, I'm in that happiness garden. I'm still in that happiness garden. And I find this is helpful. And I find that the way to nurture that garden and have access to that garden more or quicker is gratitude.
Mm.
Now, trauma, of course, is the amygdala. It's the amygdala at work. It's the memories of the amygdala. It's the amygdala. You know, all amygdala all the time. So when a therapist or practitioner of some kind is experiencing someone else's amygdala firing, their own amygdala, of course, fires in response. The therapist or practitioner has their own traumas and triggers, naturally. Then let's say you've got a horse involved, and you're just trying to keep that person alive because horses are dangerous pieces of kit. And they need you. You talked about standing up tall and finding this inner resilience and this inner resource to be able to say, I meet you where you are and I see you and I do empathize with you, but you don't have to be rude.
Yeah.
That's taken you a while, I would imagine, to get to that point. I'm sure you weren't always that
No.
good at it, right? A lot of people are coming into this field of work now in their 20s and 30s. When we first began with Horseboy, for example, it was all the people we were training were people who were already being practitioners for a long period of time, and they were just looking to add to their toolkit. They were already good at what they did. Now, this has become something of an industry, and this is a good thing because it means more people get served. But for example, some of the Horseboy centers now that are opening, we need to staff them, and we need to staff them with younger people. And you look at these people. Wow, yes, it's amazing and beautiful that you're attracted to this work, and at the same time, your life experience and your own traumas are going to, sit very front and center in your mind, and you're going to get triggered. And you're not Kim Barthel, that wealth of experience
with gray hair.
You're going to get some gray hairs in the course of this work, but what's your suggestion for people that are really coming into this line of work? Because I think a lot of times they get caught on the back foot a little bit by how demanding it can be this way emotionally.
I love all your questions and your happiness garden. Mm-hmm. Because what this work is really about. Remember at the beginning when we talked about gallivanting around the world, and we are sharing information, but we're also gathering information and evolving. Every minute is a opportunity to evolve one's self. Mm-hmm. And the truth of the work is calm and regulated is different. Regulation, and I think I said this last time, regulation is about being connected to yourself. And so it's not about being perfect. It's about being authentic. So, for example, I've got a really great example. My daughter, who I adore and love, lives here with us recently, and we have been away for 6 months and came home last night. And I came into the studio this morning just to come in and be with you. And it was a disaster.
Tipped over the tequila bottles and...
Right. It was, well, not quite like that, but not ready to be in a useful state.
Yeah.
And there's enough security in the relationship and enough security within me now to say to her, this is very frustrating.
Yeah.
Without fear of damaging the relationship.
Yeah.
So I had to connect in. Normally, 10 years ago, I would have sucked it up, cleaned it up, been pissed off, and it would have leaked out somewhere else in the relationship. Whereas if I can pause and say to myself, I don't like this. This feels like a boundary violation, or I don't feel valued in this situation, or whatever words come. I'm actually taking care of myself in that moment. And what's fascinating about that self-acknowledgement is it actually changes it. I found it quite funny in that it took me about 2 minutes, and then it was like, oh, this is such an irrelevant thing. Whereas historically, I would have been mad for 3-4 hours.
Yeah.
So that's the authentic connection where I can genuinely connect into whatever it is that is activated, whether it's little or big, and not talk myself out of it.
Mm.
Then it moves on its own, rather than me having to have it leak out, as I say, in other things that I'm trying to do. So, and I've done that with clients. I've said things like, ooh, I'm sharing this with you right now. I'm so activated. Right now, I can't be with you until I'm with me a little bit longer. I'm very authentically, I don't tell them the story of why I'm activated, but I'm
How do
very,
you make sure that doesn't trigger shame in them when you
for
do that?
sure. And plus, they're going to read it anyway. They're going to read it in my, especially a kindled amygdala,
Mhm.
is going to read the potential nonverbal of disconnection in a millisecond, and they're going to think it's about them.
So what do you say to safeguard that they don't dissolve into a puddle of shame when?
I will say, ooh, this one's mine.
Okay. So you say right up front, this is me, not you.
Or I'm with you in this one. We're in this one together. I also use a lot of humor, Rupert.
Yeah.
A lot of humor. I'm got a dry sense of humor. I make it very light.
For those of you who can't see Kim on the Zoom, she is in fact sitting here in a pink gorilla suit. It is true.
That's not true. But, it's not all gloom and doom. And
Yeah, that's true.
right,
No,
we
I
take
think
self lightly.
this is a really good point. Lightheartedness. So I one of the guidelines in Boy method, movement method, tacky in any of our programs is humor.
Yes.
Particularly toilet humor, actually, because it's an act of rebellion, for people who are over therapized and kids who've been told there's something wrong with them. And you can teach all science through poo, all science, poo all the time. But because it appeals to that sense of rebellion, it restores self-respect. Someone who's been over therapized, told that there's something wrong with them every day of their childhood, it's not good. And their spirits are often broken. And to restore self-respect, you must rebel, right? You have to. And it can give a really good way to rebel. Plus, it's actually funny, and that's connection and that's oxytocin. And also, it's funny, it's all right to do something because it's funny just for the fact that it's funny. But I do absolutely see that there can be such an overemphasis on seriousness because we're trying to be sincere, we're trying to be authentic. And we forget that part of sincerity and authenticness is, of course, when one is lighthearted. And then the diffusion of conflict through a well-timed crack is like a gift from God. It's so true. One of the things I think or I find can be tricky is that the world of therapy can definitely attract controlling or fear-based personality types who want to be therapists, perhaps because it gives them a sense of self-control of their own issues and so on, and then that can end up being projected. And so then humor goes completely out the window. This is not appropriate. This is not the place for, and that word appropriate can then be wielded like a weapon. How do you encourage humor? Because you must be dealing with some people taking themselves quite seriously.
I can be quite sassy, I think, and then quite tender. So when one of the things is that it's a moving dial, and then there's a narration of intent.
Okay, go on. What do you mean by that?
I'll
I
say,
like that.
well, if I get a perception that my humor has landed flatly or somewhat inappropriately.
By the way, wasn't Narration of Intent the supporting band in the 1983 tour of the Smiths in Canada?
I have no idea.
Well, go on. Anyway, so Narration of Intent. Okay, so when you find
And let's say
your
something
joke is
goes
falling flat.
sideways.
Yeah.
I've said something and it landed like, like you just made me laugh.
Mm-hmm.
But if I didn't, or if I had done that to you and it didn't laugh, I would have said something like, well, that didn't go so well.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, you take the joke on you.
Yeah. Or, my humor was not well timed there.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Like
that went down like a lead balloon.
yeah, exactly. I'm tracking myself
Mm-hmm.
as well as other all the time.
That's
And so I'm noticing what's going on in here in me while I'm also watching what's going on in you. And
well,
you've also got the information of the horse.
right.
Who
Well,
is,
this all
who's even better than both of us,
indeed,
right?
indeed. It's like I've been answering some of these questions myself in my head actually, because each time I ask them, I was like, yeah, but if the horse is there, they kind of co-regulate for you and bring you guys back to the present and diffuse a lot of the conflict just by the fact that they're so awesome. And but of course, then let's say someone's coming to us for a session and they're with the horse and the horse actually is picking up most of the slack this way. Let's face it, they're doing most of the work, of course. But then that person goes home.
Yes.
And they have to have tools
Mhm.
when there is no horse around. Talk to our practitioners and therapists who are listening now. What are, for you think, the most important tools that they can give their clients, families, to take home to sort of keep that positive flow going?
You talked about the happiness garden as your tool. That's a cultivation of cognition.
Cultivation of cognition.
Cognition.
They actually supported Narration of Intent, I think, at the same Smith's concert. And yeah.
See? There we go.
Yeah.
You got it. Our bands are together. So the cultivation of cognition means it's a very high order skill.
Go on.
To reflect, to know when, to shift out of the predictive brain back into the desire to cultivate happiness, to tap into gratitude. That's cognitive. And
the predictive brain being like pessimism.
Well, the predictive brain definitely has a negativity bias.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, that won't work because blah, blah, blah.
Exactly. And it doesn't even come to consciousness sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
It's just operating like Norton antivirus, running in the background, reproducing old habits.
Right.
It's neurons that fire together, wire together. And so consciousness.
Negative neuroplasticity. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Consciousness is the last level of true capacity to shift. And sometimes that happens in a second, and sometimes it takes years. And it's very difficult. So when you ask me the question, what do you give someone, or what does someone take home? Your gift of home is different for each client, dependent on their place of entry. The easiest place to create a shift is in the body, which I know you know.
Go on, though. Talk about this.
So even something as simple as I'm doing what we call a butterfly tap, which is a rhythmic tapping of the outline of my body with my hands. Even that.
I'm just going to describe for listeners because they can't see it. So what Kim did, and it's funny, the moment you started doing it, I felt a little oxytocin of connection. So she crossed her arms, so their hands, let's say you cross your arms, so one hand would be on each shoulder. And then she started to tap those shoulders and then down her arms and down her forearms like that. And it did indeed look like a bit of a butterfly. That's a cool one.
And what it does is, at a very primitive level in the nervous system, is increase the load of information of the body to the brain, which really gives you an outline of you. Like, this is me. I'm here. And it decreases the disconnection that comes with a flooded amygdala. And yes, it gives oxytocin. It also gives dopamine and serotonin, that kind of activity. But what its goal is to, in a sense, I don't even know if I like this word, but ground you or bring you back to the present moment, like a breath. So to me, the quick shift game changer in a moment can't involve much cognition.
Yeah, because the amygdala doesn't allow it. Yeah.
Mm-mm. So if I have a client or you have a child that you're working with and you're giving support to a family, even when the parent does butterfly tap as an example, then they are modeling that for the child. But as the parent moves the energy of the child themselves, it changes the energy of them both.
It's so interesting when I was at the beginning of my autism journey with my own son and was sort of being kicked around by the behavioral therapists. One of the things which, of course, they were all obsessed with was quiet hands and telling my son to stop stimming as if he could understand what they were on about anyway. And it seemed to me that he was stimming to self-regulate.
Yes.
And when I used to watch him rocking and flapping and doing that stuff, I would kind of often think, yeah, I do that actually. When I'm anxious, I rock, because later on I realized, oh, that's about the body trying to produce oxytocin to get you out of the amygdala so that you can actually think your way out of a situation. That's why we rock. I didn't know that at the time, obviously, but I would observe my own stims, and okay, they were dialed at maybe 4, whereas my sons were dialed at 11. But I remember thinking, why would you stop that? Because that's the clue to a non-verbal person's emotional state. Because sometimes the stims were happy stims, and sometimes the stims were, and it was often the same movement, but it could be expressed differently. Like a flap can be yay, and a flap can be, but it's the same movement of the wrists, right?
Well, you and I are on the same tuning fork again, because I've been running around this planet for 25 years, pleading people to see the body as a use of how we can come back into our state of ease. And please stop making people stop whatever strategy or need that they have to feel at ease in their own being. Could we please just honor that?
Back to your point about the veteran pooping his pants. And it's interesting. I was thinking about a similar experience I had myself. I was once mugged by 5 guys in a crowd in Africa. And as the fists were coming down on me and I was thinking, are they going to kill me? What are they going to do? Blah, 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 blah. I just felt myself pissing my pants. And but this little voice in my head just went, well, of course I'm pissing my pants. It's just a terrifying situation. How normal. It was interesting. There wasn't a sense of shame with it, but there might have been in another context. Who knows? But this idea of physicality in the body and giving people the nervous system and the body to work with so that they can get out of the intellect, which they can get out of shame, and then ironically reactivate the intellect, but in a more positive way, the body to the mind. The thing where we're all brutalized, I think, and some early traumas, what do you think about this, is some really standard things, like when you're first at school, you're not allowed to go to the toilet. You've got to sit there and override your bodily need and be sort of shamed if you need it. Yeah. Then again, you can then use the trip to the toilet. Can I go to the toilet, please, miss, to get out of that room? A lot of kids do, to flee. But you're basically being told to override your nervous system. And some people might say, well, that's good, because that, means that on those situations where you have to, in life, you can. But I suspect one would learn that anyway. These early cumulative unsafetynesses, you're going to be unsafe if you react to your body, then becomes a habit of not reacting to the body, and then constantly living in the amygdala, which makes us suggestible and easily manipulated and easily controlled. Okay. Before we began this recorded part of the conversation, you told me that you had been working with a school in northern Canada that is trying to do the opposite of this in an indigenous setting. And we know the indigenous settings in North America are far from perfect. And they are trying to actively decolonize education. So how are they working with the nervous system? Talk to us about that project.
How are they working with the nervous system? They are trying to begin to move from the perception of seeing themselves as victims. So the concept that you just spoke of, abandonment of self, is what I call it.
Ooh, okay.
So and this can begin at first hours after birth. If I have a caregiver who is doing the best they can with what they have, who cannot read my cues or is preoccupied with their own suffering, then I, as an infant, at the very primitive circuitry of my brain, will abandon my own body to sustain the relationship. So I'll dismiss my own hunger, I'll dismiss my own fatigue, I'll dismiss my own pain to sustain unconsciously. This is not the baby thinking, I'm going to do this. This is happening to ensure that we stay connected. This is attachment. And so, colonization disrupted a lot of what wisdom lived in many of our indigenous communities around the process of attunement and attachment. And so many of the principles that I know that you subscribe to, the use of the land, the use of nature, and the use is not the right word. Tapping back into what we know is becoming part of they have a process called land and language. Into the class, like the classroom is on the land and in the language. Reconnecting to the meaning of what we knew. And staying connected to the presence of attuned learning as opposed to fed learning in a traditional, that's what they would call colonized way. Sitting in a desk, having someone talk at you, learning through imparting of information, and remembering that there are other ways of expanding knowing, ways of knowing and being.
How far in is this project?
Brand new.
Is it all grades?
No, it's very difficult.
Meaning, no, is it all grades? Is it like K through 12? Or is it?
Oh, I thought you said, is it all great?
No.
I heard great. Is it all grades? Yes, all grades.
Okay.
From preschool till grade 12.
Any way that the listeners can find out more about this project?
Well, there is, if you look up First Nations School Board in
First
the Yukon.
Nation School Board
First
in the
Nations School
Yukon.
Board in the Yukon of Canada.
Okay.
You would see their mission page, their endeavors, the things that they.
I can feel a podcast coming.
I feel so proud of them.
First Nations
School Board, FNSB.
School Board.
And I can send you the link to their website at the SR Dialogue. Yeah.
Do you happen to have the URL even on your phone? Is your phone handy there, just so that listeners could pull over and write it down? Because I think for for all of us who are working, we don't just work in therapy, we work in education, right? We're teaching stuff
Correct.
while we're doing these things. And, we're actually delivering curriculum quite a lot of the time. I would love to find out more about land and language and
Yes,
deep
I do.
approaches. Yeah, so
www.fnsb.ca.
www.fnsb.ca. Fantastic. I'm going to contact them. Brilliant.
Awesome. Good. Whew.
Mm.
We stuck our toe in lots of different places. And
Well, so many, in fact, that we're going to have to return. I haven't even asked you also about the work you've been doing with Porges and Levine, who, of course, are, like you, among the sitteth in the firmament of scientific stuff up there on Olympus, where you guys have been. And I'd like to delve into that. I'd like to talk much more about how you view attunement and what that actually is, because it's so multifaceted, but people use that word a lot. I'd like to delve more into the nervous system stuff, but we're with the previous part of the podcast, we're probably at about the 2.5 hour thing. So I want people to know that I'm going to cheekily ask him to come back, and I'm just going to prepare a list of more questions. Kim, would you be prepared to do that? Because
yes,
I just feel there's
I have another wish on my wish list. I'm just going to put it out there. We will be back in Europe in the spring of 2025. What would be really awesome is an opportunity to actually do some work together.
Yes, please, let's do that. Do you know when you're coming?
Yes, May.
May. All right.
I can't tell you the exact date at this moment, but we'll be in Ireland, Bulgaria, Italy. Germany's not that far away.
Well, also, I work in all those countries too. So we have many projects in Ireland. Bulgaria, I've never been to, so that's a great excuse. But Italy too, we actually run retreats in Italy. We run retreats in Ireland. All right. What would that look like? Would that be like a 2-day thing, a 5-day thing, a 1-day thing? What do you think? What does a Kim Barthel thing normally look like?
Well, what I was thinking is, how could I be of service to you? Not anything else. Like my thought was, I need to learn about what you do. And how could I benefit from just like everything else, what more is there to collaborate in and learn from in your presence as well? So it's not so much what am I bringing, but what can we create together, was my thought.
Well, absolutely. I'm just trying to think. What instinctively do you feel? Do you feel it's a 2-day thing, a 3-day thing? I mean, in terms of what people can
probably we could probably have fun in 2 days.
Okay. All right. You heard it. Kim and I gonna do it 2 days in the pub in
okay.
You
sounds great. Because unlike you, I don't have the extensive experience of hanging out with the horse. Okay. And so that variable to me would be something that would really deepen the work.
Well, ponies are us. And what you'll find is you'll bust me immediately. You'll be like, oh, I see. Rupert's just full of it because the horse just does all the work. Up next, which is basically true. But going into the neurosensory stuff of why that is, how that is interesting for sure. And okay, well, I'm going to put that out there to our people that you and I will do a collaboratory thing. But I want to learn from you. So, and I know many of our listeners do too. Okay, so we'll announce that. Kim and I will get a date do together. And
all right, I'll send you when the calendar unfolds, which should be by the end of the Christmas holidays.
Okay.
Then we will have a clearer idea of our schedule.
And then, just in case you're listening to this, in fact, in 2027 or something, because these things tend to hang. Hopefully, when you get to this part of the thing, then there'll be in 2027 more of these things. So look us up. All right. So, Kim, people will want to know how to find your work and contact you. How can they contact you? Can people contact you personally? Can they engage with you as a mentor? Can you just talk us through all the options, please?
So our website, well, the name of our company is Relationship Matters.
Relationship Matters.
Relationship Matters. And the website is www.kimbarthel.ca.
Okay.
We live on all the social media platforms under Kim Barthel.
Okay.
I am tricky to connect with personally. It's really a nonstop schedule. We do mentorships, and they are not the most common thing that happens, right, in our work. And really, it's about coming and joining us when we are on the road in a workshop venue. And
Brilliant.
thank you.
Okay. So will you come back on
Yes.
and we can keep this conversation going?
Yeah.
There's got more.
Yes.
that we
It's
need.
fun. As I said, the tuning fork is resonant, so let's do it.
And I'm going to throw this one open to listeners. Lads, if you've got questions, send them into me, admin@ntls.co, and we will make sure that we hold Kim's feet to the fire to get answers for those things, because I know so many people do have questions for you. And our mutual friend, Liana Tang, who is an amazing occupational therapist who works with the most dangerous criminals in lockdown in psych units and in the Midwest, is also, I feel, a mentor, and he brought us together. So
Agree.
what I might do, if it's all right, is bring her in actually on the next podcast, and then we could make it a three-way thing.
Amazing.
Yeah, that'd be good. Okay.
Brilliant.
I'm going to accept. All
right.
Kim, amazing. Thank you.
Happy holidays.
To you too. Speak soon. Okay.
You bet. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Join our website, newtrailslearning.com, to check out our online courses and live workshops in Horseboy Method, Movement Method, and Athena. These evidence-based programs have helped children, veterans, and people dealing with trauma around the world. We also offer a horse training program and self-care program for riders on longridehome.com. These include easy-to-do online courses and tutorials that bring you and your horse joy. For an overview of all shows and programs, go to rupertisaacson.com. See you on the next show. And please remember to press subscribe and share.